The house was silent in a way that felt unnatural, a sterile quiet that Helen Miller had never grown accustomed to. In her small home across town, silence was filled with the gentle hum of an old refrigerator or the rustle of leaves against a window pane. Here, in her son David's new modern residence, the silence was cold and empty, broken only by the low thrum of the central air conditioning. She padded softly down the hallway, her bare feet cold against the polished concrete floors. The walls were a stark white, adorned with abstract art she didn't understand, a world away from the framed school photos and handmade quilts that colored her own life. She was just heading to the kitchen for a glass of water, a simple act that now felt like an intrusion in this vast, minimalist space that was supposed to be her home, too. As she neared the living room, the faint murmur of voices stopped her. She recognized the soft, persuasive tone of her daughter-in-law, Jessica, followed by David's hesitant replies. Hidden in the shadows of the hallway, Helen listened as Jessica painted a picture of a life that was both beautiful and cruel. She spoke of a high-end assisted living facility, not as a place of abandonment, but as a gift. It would be the greatest proof of their love, she argued. A place where Helen would receive specialized, 24-hour care from professionals, freeing them from the worry. Every word was carefully chosen, a silken trap designed to sound like compassion. Helen could hear the conflict in her son's voice, the strained justifications he offered, each one weaker than the last as Jessica's logic tightened around him. The final blow came not with a shout, but with a sigh of resignation. "You're right," David said, his voice heavy with a guilt that did little to soften the impact of his words. "It's for the best. It's the right thing to do for her." For Helen, standing frozen in the darkness, that simple agreement was a physical shock, a silent shattering of the world she had built. The son whose scraped knees she had bandaged, whose college textbooks she had paid for with aching hands and double shifts, had just agreed to send her away. She didn't make a sound. She didn't gasp or cry. Instead, she felt a profound and hollow ache spread through her chest, the kind of pain that has no voice, a quiet collapse of a lifetime of sacrifice into a single, devastating moment of betrayal. Without a thought for the water she came for, Helen turned and retreated back down the hallway, each step a monumental effort. The cold of the floor seemed to seep into her bones, a chilling finality to the conversation she was never meant to hear. She sat on the edge of the bed in the guest room, a room that had never felt like her own, and stared at her hands. They were a map of her life, calloused and wrinkled from decades of cleaning other people's homes so her son could have a better one. He was a doctor now, a success, and she, it seemed, was the last remnant of a past he was being convinced to discard. It's in these quiet, heartbreaking moments that you realize how many stories of silent sacrifice go untold. If you feel these stories deserve a voice, your subscription helps us continue to share them. The drive to the assisted living facility was a blur of muted colors and silent acquiescence. Helen sat in the passenger seat of David's luxury sedan, the leather cool against her skin, and watched her small town roll by. She didn't protest or cry. She simply accepted, believing it was the only way to avoid being a burden on her son's happiness. The facility, named Maple Creek Senior Living, was clean and orderly, but it had the unmistakable scent of antiseptic and resignation. A cheerful young woman led her to a small, beige room with a single window overlooking a manicured but lifeless garden. The door clicked shut behind her, and in that sterile quiet, Helen felt the full weight of her new reality. She was a relic, carefully stored away in a box that was meant to look like a gift, a vinyl chapter written by someone else. Her mind drifted back through the years, not to grand moments, but to the quiet, grueling work that had defined her life. She remembered the sting of bleach on her chapped hands as she scrubbed floors in the town's bank after hours, the ache in her back a constant companion. She could almost smell the industrial-grade cleaner, a scent that clung to her clothes and hair, a perfume of sacrifice. After each shift, she would come home to find a young David asleep at the kitchen table, his head pillowed on an open textbook. She would gently lift him, his growing frame already heavy, and carry him to bed, her heart swelling with a fierce, protective pride. Every dollar she earned, every hour of lost sleep, was a brick laid in the foundation of his future, a future she was now exiled from. There was one winter she would never forget. The year David was a sophomore in high school and needed a new computer for a programming class he was desperate to take. The cost was astronomical to her, an impossible sum. Without a second thought, she sold the one piece of valuable jewelry she owned, a delicate gold locket her own mother had given her. She told David she had misplaced it, a small lie to shield him from the weight of her sacrifice. He got the computer and excelled in the class. His face lit with excitement as he showed her the lines of code that looked like a foreign language to her. He'd hugged her tightly then, promising, "One day, Mum, I'll buy you a whole house, the biggest one in town." The memory was a bittersweet echo in the beige room, a promise that had curdled into a cruel irony. In the common room at Maple Creek, Helen saw versions of her own story reflected in the tired eyes of the other residents. They were parents and grandparents, builders and teachers, now reduced to silent figures, watching a television that was always too loud. She noticed a man named Arthur Henderson, a former carpenter with hands as gnarled as old wood, who pushed his food around his plate but never ate. He had not spoken a word in weeks, the nurses said, lost in a fog of grief after his wife passed and his children moved him here. Helen saw not a lost cause, but a man starving for more than just food. She saw a flicker of the same abandonment she felt in her own heart, and a familiar, deep-seated instinct began to stir within her, the instinct to nurture and to heal. The next day, she approached his table not with a tray, but with a simple question. "Mr. Henderson," she said softly, "I heard you built the old gazebo in the town square. My David used to love climbing on it as a boy." For the first time, his eyes focused on her. She didn't try to force him to eat. Instead, she just sat with him, sharing small memories of the town they both knew, of parades and summer fairs. She spoke of her son's dreams and her pride. Slowly, hesitantly, he picked up his spoon and took a small bite of soup. It was a tiny victory, unnoticed by most, but for Helen, it was the first crack of light in the suffocating darkness. She was not just a resident, she was needed. Her quiet mission expanded. She saw Margaret, a woman whose once vibrant eyes were now clouded with confusion, her long grey hair matted and uncared for. One afternoon, Helen found a soft bristled brush and sat beside her. She didn't speak at first, simply beginning to gently work through the tangles, her movements slow and rhythmic, the way she used to brush her own mother's hair. As she worked, she began to hum a simple old lullaby. Margaret leaned into the touch, a tear tracing a path down her wrinkled cheek. Helen finished by weaving the soft, clean hair into a neat braid. It's in these moments, when a simple act of kindness can change someone's entire world, that we are reminded of our shared humanity. If this message resonates with you, subscribing to our channel allows us to bring more such stories to light. David's visits were brief and strained, filled with an awkward silence that hung heavy between them. He'd arrive bearing expensive flowers that wilted in the stuffy room, or boxes of chocolates she couldn't eat, tokens of a guilt he couldn't voice. He saw her sitting in the common room, surrounded by her new companions, and mistook her quiet purpose for sad resignation. He saw what he needed to see, a mother who was settling in, which eased his conscience just enough to allow him to leave. He never asked about her new friends or noticed the light returning to her eyes. He was trapped in his own narrative of doing the right thing. Unable to see the woman he had abandoned was once again building a home out of nothing. Jessica, meanwhile, meticulously crafted a very different story for the public. Her social media was a gallery of curated compassion. She would post photos from their visits, always positioning Helen between herself and David, a forced smile on everyone's face. The captions were masterfully written. "Making sure our greatest treasure gets the best care," one read. "So wonderful to see Mom thriving with her new friends," said another. To the small town, they were the perfect, caring family. The digital illusion was flawless, a beautiful facade hiding the cold truth of their choices. Each post was a small, public lie that chipped away at David's soul while polishing the veneer of their new, respectable life in the community. But reality has a way of seeping through the cracks of even the most perfect facade. The staff at Maple Creek saw the truth. They saw Helen arriving each morning in the common room before anyone else, making sure the coffee was ready. They saw her holding hands with residents during their darkest moments of fear or confusion. They saw the way Mr. Henderson now waited for her at lunch, and how Margaret's smile would appear whenever Helen entered the room. The nurses, initially just doing a job, started to see their work through her eyes. They began calling her Mama Helen, a term of endearment spoken with a reverence that acknowledged she was the true heart of their community, providing a care that no chart or medication could ever measure. The stories of Mama Helen's quiet miracles began to travel beyond the walls of the facility. Arthur Henderson's son came to visit and was stunned to find his father not just eating, but engaged in a lively conversation about woodworking with another resident. When he asked what had happened, a nurse simply pointed to Helen, who was helping another woman write a letter to her grandchild. He left that day with tears in his eyes and a story on his lips, a story he shared with his neighbors, his co-workers, and anyone who would listen. Stories like this, passed from person to person, have a way of revealing the truth that often hides in plain sight. We believe in the power of these truths, and your subscription is what empowers us to keep uncovering them. A quiet current of conversation began to flow through the town. At the local diner and the grocery store, people talked. They spoke of the wonderful woman at the nursing home who was bringing joy back to their forgotten parents. At the same time, they saw Jessica's polished social media posts, and a subtle disconnect began to form in their minds. The town was small, and memories were long. People remembered Helen Miller, the woman who worked tirelessly and without complaint to raise a son on her own. The narrative was slowly shifting, not through accusation or gossip, but through the undeniable, radiant force of Helen's own character, which shone brighter than any filtered photograph. One evening, as the sun set outside her window, Helen sat not in her room, but in the bustling common area. She watched Arthur and another man play a game of checkers, heard Margaret laughing at a joke, and felt a profound sense of peace. Her world had not ended, it had simply been replanted. She had lost a son to a life of cold ambition, but she had gained a new family, a garden of souls she could tend to. This was her new purpose. The pain of David's betrayal had not vanished, but it had been transformed into a catalyst for a different kind of love. She was no longer Helen Miller, the discarded mother. She was Mama Helen, the heart of Maple Creek, and her victory was in the quiet dignity of a life rebuilt on her own terms. The invitation arrived on crisp, official letterhead announcing the annual Inspiring Citizens ceremony held by the town council. David and Jessica received theirs as guests of honor, a fact Jessica mentioned to everyone they knew. She assumed with unwavering confidence that it was a celebration of David's success, a formal welcome for the town's promising new doctor. They sat in the front row of the town hall, a picture of civic pride. A few rows behind them, Helen sat quietly with Arthur Henderson and a few other friends from Maple Creek, brought by a kind nurse who had heard she was the true guest of honor. Helen wore a simple dress she'd owned for years, her hands folded in her lap, feeling a calm that had nothing to do with public recognition and everything to do with the quiet contentment she had found for herself. After a few opening remarks, the mayor introduced Arthur Henderson's son, a quiet mechanic named Tom, to say a few words about the evening's honoree. Tom walked to the podium, his hands gripping the sides, his voice unsteady at first. He spoke of his father's profound loneliness after his mother's passing, the silence that had swallowed him whole when he moved to Maple Creek. He described the pain of visiting a parent who had given you everything, only to see a vacant stare in return. The room grew still, the polite applause fading into a heavy silence. David shifted uncomfortably in his seat, the words a faint echo of his own guilt. Jessica, however, simply saw it as a sad but necessary prelude to the main event, completely oblivious to the storm that was about to break over their perfectly constructed world. Then Tom's voice grew stronger, filled with a gratitude that was almost overwhelming. "My father was lost," he said, his eyes finding Helen in the crowd. And then an angel arrived, an angel who didn't wear a uniform or carry a clipboard, but who came with patience and a story. She sat with him when no one else would. He paused, taking a deep breath before delivering the final, devastating blow to the town's carefully crafted illusion. "And with the same hands that once washed floors to put a doctor through school," he said, his voice ringing with clarity, "she now soothes the heads of parents forgotten by their own." A collective, audible gasp swept through the hall. Every eye in the room turned from Tom, past a pale and frozen Jessica, and settled on David, whose face had crumpled in on itself with the force of a physical impact. The carefully maintained facade of David's life shattered in that single, public moment. A sob escaped him, a raw, ragged sound of a man broken by the truth. He stumbled from his seat and walked, almost blindly, toward the stage. He didn't wait for an invitation. He simply took the microphone from Tom's stunned hand. The room was so quiet he could hear his own frantic breaths. "She's right," he choked out, his words directed not to the crowd but to the floor, to the past, to the son he had failed to be. He finally looked up, his eyes locking with his mother's. "I'm so sorry, Mum." Tears streamed down his face as he spoke the words that were a lifetime overdue. "Your home is with me. I am your home." He walked over to Helen, who had risen from her seat, her expression one of sorrow, not triumph. He wrapped his arms around her small frame, burying his face in her shoulder, and for the first time since he was a boy, he allowed his mother to comfort him. The townspeople rose to their feet, their applause a thunderous wave of affirmation, not for the doctor, but for the mother who had never stopped giving. In the front row, Jessica sat alone, motionless, the sound of the ovation, a deafening roar of her own public humiliation. The spotlight was no longer on her or her successful husband. It was on the quiet, dignified woman whose love had just been proven to be the most valuable thing in the entire town, a treasure her son had almost thrown away. The drive back from the town hall was a stark contrast to the one that had taken her to Maple Creek. The silence was no longer heavy with unspoken guilt, but filled with a fragile, healing quiet. When they walked through the front door, the house felt just as cold and empty as before, but something had fundamentally shifted. Jessica was gone, her absence a palpable relief. David didn't need to explain the details. Helen understood. He simply led his mother to the main bedroom, the one with the large window, and said, "This is your room now, Mom. It always should have been." There were no grand pronouncements. Only the simple, profound truth of a son finally coming home to himself. Helen touched the soft comforter on the bed, her rough hands a testament to the life that had brought them to this moment, and for the first time in months, she felt the deep, grounding sense of belonging she thought she had lost forever. In the weeks that followed, the house began to breathe again. The sterile white walls were slowly populated with framed photographs from David's childhood, and the scent of Helen's apple pie replaced the faint, chemical smell of air freshener. It was a slow, gentle reclamation, witnessing his mother's quiet grace. David felt a purpose ignite within him that his medical career alone had never provided. He sold the abstract art and used the money to create the Miller Foundation, a non-profit dedicated to providing free medical care and companionship for the town's elderly. He converted a section of his clinic into a welcoming community space where seniors could gather, share stories, and feel seen. It was his apology written not in words, but in action, a living tribute to the woman who had shown him that true success wasn't about what you owned, but about the lives you touched. The story of that night at the town hall became a quiet legend, a turning point for the community. It served as a powerful reminder that the elderly were not burdens to be managed, but libraries of experience to be cherished. Families started visiting Maple Creek more often, not out of obligation, but with a renewed sense of connection. Arthur Henderson and Margaret became regular guests at David and Helen's home for Sunday dinner, their laughter filling the rooms that were once achingly silent. The community center David founded became the new heart of the town, a place where the lines between generations blurred. Helen, in her simple, unassuming way, had not just healed a few lonely souls. She had gently guided an entire town back to a more compassionate version of itself, proving that one person's quiet dignity could indeed spark a revolution of the heart. Helen never saw her victory as a triumph over Jessica, or even as a lesson for her son. For her, it was simply a return to the natural order of things, a restoration of love. She found her greatest joy not in the public recognition, but in the small, everyday moments, watching David talk animatedly about a patient he'd helped at the center, or listening to Arthur tell a joke that made the whole table laugh. David, free from the weight of pretense, discovered a happiness that was more profound and authentic than any status symbol could ever provide. He had learned the most important lesson of his life, not in a medical textbook, but from the unwavering strength of his mother's love. Stories like Helen's remind us that it's never too late for redemption, and that honoring the hands that raised us is the truest measure of our character. Your support helps us ensure these powerful lessons of love and forgiveness continue to be told.